Look at this game. The violence, the death, the horror. In the early era of video games, this was actually the reaction of some people. Welcome to Death Race. This 1976 arcade game was one of the first gaming controversies, featuring the violent death of countless gremlins. They're gremlins. Yeah, so, not only was this one of the first violent games to ever cause a controversy, but it was also one of the first to feature a developer who knew how to milk that controversy for all it was worth, letting well intended activists who only wanted to shut down the game propel its sales even further. Through savvy marketing and excellent repurpose of already existing assets and some pretty sharp and edgy graphic art, Death Race was an arcade hit. In this video, we're going to tell the story of Grand Theft Auto's great 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 grandfather. The story of Death Race actually starts in 1975 as Destruction Derby. That game was produced by Exidy Games. Exidy was formed by Pete Kaufman. Kaufman had worked for RomTech, a graphics terminal company which began to make coin-operated video games as a side project. Convinced that the industry had more potential, Kaufman left and formed Exidy. One of the company's first games was Destruction Derby. In that game, players drive a car around an arena, attempting to hit cars that are controlled by the computer. Players got points for how well they were able to figure out where the computer-controlled cars were going, and if they were able to successfully demolish their opponent. The game was flying off the production line, and Exidy needed help building capacity. As such, they licensed a version of the game to Chicago Coin, thus creating Demolition Derby. There was a problem. Chicago Coin was failing financially and unable to make payments on the game. Even worse, Chicago Coin still had the license to the game, meaning that Exidy was stuck. Now trapped with a version of the game that they couldn't adequately produce, Exidy realized they had to pivot. Without access to their main game, Kaufman was forced to reprogram Demolition Derby into something he could sell. As such, he hired another engineer from his old company, a man named Howell Ivy. Ivy reprogrammed the game, turning cars into people. I'm sorry, that's right. I meant gremlins that were escaping from a cemetery. Yes, that's right, these are gremlins, not people. I guess the idea of running over actual people was too controversial, even for a game that was intending to cause some controversy. After all, it's not like these guys look like people or anything. And besides, it says you're running over gremlins. See? Right there, right in the middle of the screen. Gremlins. Anyway, the new game, Death Race 98, later shortened to Death Race, was born. Once you ran over the people, gremlins, whatever, they died and turned into little graves, complete with these adorable little crosses. Of course, the crosses actually made the game more complicated because you couldn't run through them when you were trying to chase your next gremlin. Aside from that, the game was pretty standard for the time. The top and bottom of the screen acted like warp tunnels, and reversing allowed you to drive much faster. Your goal was to run over as many gremlins as possible before time ran out. From there, you got a score based on the amount of gremlins you killed. Score a mere 1 to 3 points, and you were only a skeleton chaser. Kill more than 21 gremlins? Then you were an expert driver. The game itself came in this pretty cool looking cabinet, designed by Pat Peake. As you can see, it was different than what was standard for the time. It used steering wheels instead of joysticks, and featured a gas pedal as well as a switch that allowed you to go into reverse. Furthermore, the cabinet's monitor required players to look down, not at eye level. That allowed for the deployment of some downright awesome art. Adding to the fun, the game allowed for simultaneous two-player play, meaning that you and a friend could try to coordinate who ran over what and get the highest possible score. For those of you who are movie buffs, this game may sound familiar. Contrary to the rumor at the time, Death Race was not a licensed version of the 1975 movie Death Race 2000. In the movie, participants in a death race get points for killing pedestrians. So here's the thing. The game did okay, but not great. At least not at first. According to Paul Jacobs, who ran marketing for Exidy, the game only sold about 1,000 copies when it first came out, which was a relatively low number for the time. Kaufman attributed the lack in sales to the content of the game, which kicked up some controversy at a time when arcades were still trying to shed their history as being morally dubious places. So what happened? Why are we doing a video on a game that is nearly 50 years old and only sold 1,000 copies? So the press got involved. Let's remember the year. It was 1976 when Death Race came out. Arcade games were mostly limited to racing, rudimentary sports, and some military titles. Nothing was this graphic. And yes, I do mean graphic. While there was violence in video games, it was confined to warfare. There was nothing that depicted the death of humans or humanoids. As such, when the local press got a hold of the game, it began to generate real controversy. Controversy started on a trade magazine level, with magazines like Replay Magazine covering the game. The stories noted what the game was, you could run over stick figures, all that, and when the game came out. However, that wasn't it, and the story about Death Race was about to build considerably. Things got really popular for Death Race once Wendy Walker, a reporter for the Associated Press, ran a story on the game. In the story, Walker describes the game as allowing players to run over, quote, skeletal figures that, quote, bear strong resemblances to people. When hit by a car, they emit a shrieking sound, something like the scream of a child, and turn into grave markers. Exidy leaned in. In the article, Paul Jacobs of the marketing department said, quote, if people get a kick out of running down pedestrians, you have to let them do it. Wow. Jacobs also tried to say that the game was tongue-in-cheek, adding, quote, the name Death Race may shock a few people, but we find the game humorous. Then, and stop me if you've heard this before, the article went for the jugular. It interviewed a Dr. Bry Meeks, a child psychologist who, according to the article, once worked with, quote, aggressive inmates at California's San Quentin prison. Dr. Meeks was not happy about the game. Said Dr. Meeks, quote, a game like that appeals to the morbidity in a person. That type of preoccupation with violence was common in the prisoners I dealt with. They would have loved the game. Someone could argue that people act out their hostilities by playing games, but it has been proven time and time again that violence often comes from modeling. Folks, we've got a moral panic. The Associated Press stories ran in outlets across the country, and really the world, as the game started to get international press. And it didn't stop there. Further articles appeared in the New York Times, the National Enquirer, and Midnight Magazine. There was even a TV story on 60 Minutes, the hit American news show, that covered the psychological impact of games, including Death Race. In later interviews, Paul Jacobs would say that the controversy spread to Canada, England, Germany, and more. Other groups obviously got involved. For example, the National Safety Council described themselves as outraged by the violence in the game, noting that, quote, the person is no longer just a spectator, but now an actor in the process of creating violence. How insane did this get? A 1977 article by the Tucson Daily Citizen showed a photo of a girl playing the game and asked, quote, will chasing down pedestrians on TV screen now encourage her to cut pedestrians down on real highways later? Holy crap. Thank God that's not true. We'd all be dead thanks to Grand Theft Auto. It got so bad that Exidy had to hire security guards to face down all the death threats they received. And there are even unconfirmed reports that the building received bomb threats. In Japan, a distributor was apparently briefly jailed for selling the game, although no country ever outright banned it. And, surprise, surprise, all the negative coverage helped to boost sales, not smother them. In 1976, the year that the game came out, Replay magazine declared that Death Race was the 8th most popular arcade game in the United States. By 1977, it rose to 7th most popular. The company made $3 million off of the game in 1976. Now, that's not to say that everyone in the arcade industry was happy with Death Race's development. Keep in mind that the history of arcades was just starting to leave behind a pretty nasty and slightly strange chapter. Pinball and other electromechanical games were once considered to be forms of gambling that were heavily influenced by the mafia. This led to pinball machines being banned in many places, including New York by the mayor at the time, Fiorello LaGuardia. LaGuardia argued that the mob was involved in pinball and used it for racketeering purposes. The ban was ultimately lifted in 1976, the same year that Death Race came out, but that's not to say that arcades, which were tainted by association, were completely in the clear. The concern was that the controversy about arcades could be used to hurt the industry later. Nolan Bushnell, founder and president of Atari, said, quote, we were really unhappy with that game. We had an internal rule that we wouldn't allow violence against people. You could blow up a tank or you could blow up a flying saucer, but you couldn't blow up people. We felt that that was not good form, and we adhered to that all during my tenure. Fortunately, the industry heeded Bushnell's wisdom and never used controversy to sell a game again, as long as you don't count games like Custer, Chiller, all the Grand Theft Autos, Mortal Kombat, JFK Reloaded. Okay, I was lying. I was completely lying. It happened all the time. Exidy helped the medium evolve by helping it, honestly, kind of devolve. Controversy sells. Exidy proved the technique to be useful in the world of video games. By 1977, Exidy had become the third biggest manufacturer of arcade games. As Paul Jacobs said, quote, Exidy laughed all the way to the bank. Exidy would continue to make games along the lines of Death Race, including Car Polo and Super Death Chase, which honestly sounds like a pretty cool sounding name. Super Death Chase was the sequel to Death Race, but only a few copies were ever produced. In addition to the continued development of computer games, the company also expanded into the manufacturing of microprocessors. That led to the development of their Sorcerer personal computer. They would also continue to push arcade game boundaries. In 1978, they produced Starfire. In addition to its deeply unique cabinet, Starfire became the first to ever allow players to enter a high score with their initials. The video game crash of 1983 would hit Exidy hard, and they would declare bankruptcy by 1985. They emerged from bankruptcy and briefly returned to their video game roots to make Chiller, the highly controversial and violent torture game. In 1989, they left video games to concentrate on redemption games. In 1995, the company folded after an employee embezzled $300,000. In 2006, Mean Hamster Software, quite a name, acquired the rights to market Exidy games. However, Mean Hamster went out of business in 2012, and unless I'm missing something, that's the end of Exidy's game property. Death Race was reborn in 1990 when American Game Cartridges made a Nintendo version of the game. As you can imagine, it featured greatly improved graphics and controls. It also involved missiles, guns, and 8 different cities. The game is super violent, and if you know anything about Nintendo, it won't surprise you to learn that it was a unlicensed title. Of course, for those of you who were still alive then, you may remember Death Race fondly. And there are plenty of reports of friends playing each other and, well, trying to run over each other rather than kill the gremlins. It's amazing to think that a game that is so tame by our standards was once the source of international controversy. But I guess that speaks volumes about how far we've come, or how far backwards we've gone, depending on how you look at things. So, you made it here. If you did, that must mean you liked the video. If I'm right and you did, please hit that like or subscribe button and let me know what other videos you want to see in the comments. Alternatively, make sure to click on the next video that the almighty YouTube algorithm has served up for you. Regardless of what you do next, I hope you had a wonderful day out there, and I hope you liked watching this video as much as I liked making it. Take care, everybody.